Welcome to Shira Audiobook. If you're finding joy in the fanfiction, I'd be thrilled if you could subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comment. Chapter 3. 1000 Hands OC Senju SI. 10 years before the Second Great Shinobi World War, Nara Shikahime. Troublesome, she thought to herself as she walked into the classroom and found the seat that she'd been forced to occupy for the past 2 years filled by someone else. She almost tripped over her feet in surprise when she entered and found the Kurama boy sitting next to her senju cousin. She'd expected the boy to get bored of her eventually, but the fact that it had taken him 2 years to do so was just something else. By his right sat Uchiha Izuku, the only polite member of the family in her generation. She wasted no time in taking her seat blissfully far away from the spotlight that followed the senju on every waking hour. She heard a sound from their place in the center of the classroom and enjoyed observing from a distance the melodious tones the Kurama boy produced with the flute he held in his hands. It was a beautiful thing, made of pale wood that was so white it looked to be ivory from certain angles. The holes were perfectly circular, just as the mouth opening was made perfectly suited for the boy's mouth. It was the work of a master craftsman, and the sheer cost of it would probably have bankrupted many a family. A lovely gift, Senju-san. Shorirama, please, Kizuru. I've told you a dozen times, call me by my name. Well, that answered one question. The gift had come from the senju boy. Of course, he had hyuga blood on one side and senju on the other. She doubted anyone would ever have access to the kind of wealth he did. The bulk of the village was built on senju land, after all. Play me something else, please, he said after the Kurama boy said something to him. A melodic tune began to spread across the classroom. A haunting tone that both said everything and nothing at the same time. Shikahime would hesitate to call herself an expert in music. No, Nara really could. But she did know what good music sounded like. She'd attended enough festivals and celebrations to make it clear to her what a master of their craft could produce. What she heard Kurama Kizuru produce was not at all far away from what those people could create. It made her wonder when he'd begun practicing the instrument. It also made her wonder just how the senju boy had been able to find out about it in time to procure such a gift for the other boy's birthday. It didn't matter though. Spending her time basking in the privacy of not being the center of attention should have been enough for her. She leaned backwards and hoped to drift off into sleep. She should have had 20 minutes until their sensei showed up. Of course, the universe decided to put all her expectations to shame. Her desk exploded in sound as someone slammed a hand down on it. She opened her eyes and came face to face with orbs of smoldering coal that looked like they were permanently alight with fire. Uchiha Uzume. Her black hair fell down her face in ringlets that framed high cheekbones in perfect lighting. You're on my seat, Nara, she snarled, and it took Shikahime a second to parse the words and realize that the rude girl was indeed right. Somehow in her relief and haste to find a seat away from the center of attention, she'd ended up on the seat that the Uchiha girl favored. She cursed herself for it, knowing that she'd now have to stand up and move all the way across the classroom with everyone's eyes staring at her. Not once did the thought of resistance cross her mind. Only 2 people could match up with the Uchiha girl when it came to the ninja arts, and she definitely wasn't one of them. She prepared to stand up, and the bad situation suddenly got much worse as she felt a hand on her shoulder. What are you doing, Uzume? Her cousin said, staring down the Uchiha girl with his head tilted to the side. Your little cousin is on my seat, she said, stepping closer to the boy who had taken the space between them. Shikahime wanted to roll up in a ball like a child and cry her feelings out. Because how had this gotten this bad? She knew that she should be thankful to her cousin for stepping up to defend her, but she wanted nothing more than to scream at him for standing up and involving himself in this. If she hadn't already been the center of attention, then having the 2 best students in the class in a face-off over her choice of seating position would ensure it. I'm sure no seats have any names on them. The seats are first come, first served, Uzume. Sensei has made this clear more than once, I know. And so do you, he said simply, weathering the glare that she tossed at him with no discernible reaction. I've sat on the same chair for 17 months, Senju. Don't play with me. Her voice rose now, making Shikahime shrink further in the chair. No longer a whisper that promised violence, her voice was now a snarl that assured it. Doesn't matter, he said, and in the blink of an eye, he caught a punch that had been sent flying at his head. Now, the entire class was on high alert. Uchiha Uzume proved to be deserving of her class ranking as the number 1 student by sweeping her leg forward and sending a high kick slamming for his head. Her cousin simply released the hand in his grip before moving his head backwards an inch to allow her foot to sail past his face with no effect before rushing at her. Shikahime had very little doubts about how this would go. It was only her cousin's terrible shuriken jutsu marks that made him second place to the Uchiha girl. It was a testament to his skill that the gap between them was still so close when one considered that he was dead last in the class when it came to kunai and shuriken throwing. He stepped into the Uchiha girl's space before she could recover from the attack and released a duo of quick jabs at her face. The first hit, she used the momentum to send herself rolling backwards. She came up weaving hand seals, only for her hands to be caught in a solid grip before she could continue. A great fireball jutsu in a closed classroom is more stupid than anything I've ever seen any of you attempt, Uraraka-sensei's voice rang out. Shikahime absently checked the clock and noted that they still had about 10 minutes until the bell was supposed to ring. That, at the very least, went a step in confirming her theory. Senju-san, Uchiha-san. Detention. You will both be staying behind after class today, and this incident will be going on both your records, he said, before moving back to the front of the class and picking up a stick of chalk. Today was supposed to mark the beginning of survival and camping training, but since you all clearly have too much energy, we'll be doing some endurance training instead, he said, the rest of the class predictably erupting in mutinous groans and whispers. Even her cousin winced at the announcement. Endurance training wasn't fun for anyone. Especially now that Uraraka-sensei had begun adding genjutsu detection training to the mix. Chop, chop, you should be at the lineup already. Last there gets to do an extra lap for good measure, sensei said, and the class moved almost as one. Her cousin was, predictably, at the very front of the line with his unholy speed. She hastened to take off and join the others. She couldn't end up being the one to take the extra lap. 4x Sarutobi Omoikane. He lounged against the tree stump while taking a look around the gathering. He hadn't thought that this would be what the gatherings would look like when he'd first heard of them and pursued an invitation. He'd expected secret training of powerful ninjutsu or something like that, but while Izuku-san and Shorirama-san did show off some ninjutsu on their own, it definitely was not the center of the meetings. These were, and he still felt strange thinking it, almost like leisurely gatherings. The idea that the Senju heir, the cousin to Uchiha clan head and so many other clan heirs would gather during the weekends to play music and games would have been ridiculous to him if he wasn't looking right at it. How's the grill coming along, Choni? He heard the Inuzuka say from his position opposite him and turned his attention to the Akamichi who was expertly managing a large outdoor grill and flipping pieces of meat on it. Next to the grill was a platter of various fruits and vegetables that had been provided for the entire gathering but would only end up being touched by the Senju who refused to eat meat for whatever reason. Speaking of the Senju, he was in the complete opposite end of the courtyard in front of a series of targets. Next to him stood Uchiha Izuku and they whispered between themselves for a bit before Senju walked backwards and primed the bow. In the space between seconds, the bullseye of all 3 targets had arrows sticking out of them. How? He asked himself, suddenly sitting upright. He heard the Senju bark a laugh as the Uchiha boy seemingly shared his shock at the state of things. Play us something, Kizuru. Izuku owes us a song, the Senju said, walking away from the targets and dragging his Uchiha friend with him. 4x. Senju Shorirama vs Uchiha Izuku, Uraraka-sensei said, gesturing to the raised platform set aside for the sparring matches. The friendly duo wasted no time in marching to the platform and taking their places. Ready to kiss the ground? Shorirama-san asked with a smile on his face. Yeah, this isn't going to be anything like last time. Before Shorirama could offer a reply on his own, Uraraka-sensei interrupted, commanding them to form the seal of confrontation. They executed it in unison, and once Sensei's hand fell, the Uchiha was on the move. He ran forward in quick, long strides before kicking at his opponent's head. The boy with hair like silk weaved around the attack with ease before trying to step into his friend's guard. Izuku sent off 2 quick jabs. Both were dodged in succession. The Senju went on the attack, sending a knife hand at his friend's throat that forced him to flinch backwards. He wasted no time and took advantage of the hesitation, stomping on the other boy's foot and refusing to let up. Izuku's attempt to pull his foot out from under his friend was met with harsh resistance. Shorirama unleashed 3 quick jabs into his friend's face before lifting his foot and allowing him to backpedal. Izuku stumbled backwards for a second before abandoning his training and diving right at his opponent. They landed on the floor with a harsh crash, the Uchiha on top. He scrambled to press his weight down on Shorirama before lifting his upper body a bit. He wailed into his opponent, punch after punch, hitting the senju boy in the face even if they failed to do much damage on their own as Izuku couldn't get much force behind them. As Izuku pulled his hand back for another punch, Shori's head followed him, slamming into his friend's forehead and sending the boy reeling. Suddenly and smoothly, Shorirama used his footwork to grab a hold of Izuku's waist before rolling them over so he was the one on top. And when on top, he wasted no time. 3 punches in and all of Izuku's resistance had faded. Shorirama landed 2 more punches before standing up and pulling his dazed friend upright to join him. "Good show, boys. Now form the seal of reconciliation," Sensei said. Izuku needed a second or two to get his wits about him, but once he did, he formed the seal in good faith, and they left the platform. "Inuzuka Inakuro vs Uchiha Uzume," Sensei said, making Omoikane sigh to himself. There was only one way this was going to go, and it wouldn't be fun for anyone watching. The Uchiha girl was way too aggressive and brutal, while the Inuzuka boy had much more pride than common sense. She'd beat him black and blue while he'd keep standing up to take more and more. He was a glutton for punishment. Just like he'd predicted, the fight began with Inakuro running right at Uchiha-san. She weaved underneath both his swipes before punching him in the side. Kidney shot, he heard Shorirama wince to himself from behind him. Inakuro flinched but showed no more pain than that as he commanded his legs into a kick that Uchiha-san had an easy time bending underneath. She sprung up with an uppercut that he stepped away from. It was the beginning of a combo, however. Not one that Inakuro was well poised to deal with. She punched at his solar plexus, forcing him to block before she kicked him in the shin. He stepped back, but she used that opportunity to tangle her feet with his and force him to the ground. She stepped backwards, allowing him ample time to stand up. He didn't take the display of sportsmanship well and dove right at her just like Izuku had done with Shorirama. The difference here was that he telegraphed every aspect of his dive, and Uchiha-san had ample time to react. She jumped upwards, stretching out a single foot that Inakuro's head slammed into. He fell to the ground, battered and unconscious. XXXXX Kurama Kizuru 9 years before the Second Great Shinobi World War. He watched his favorite classmate walk into the room with an easy smile on his face. He'd just finished with his assessment tests, and like exactly everyone expected, ours seemed to have had an easy time of it. Of course he did. None of the outs they'd asked Kizuru to do had been things Shori had had any difficulty with at all. After all, it had been him who'd helped Kizuru learn everything it would take to pass the exams. Especially the ninjutsu. For a family with a preternatural disposition for genjutsu, his family had an equally famous aversion to most forms of ninjutsu. The fact that the academy required to C-rank elemental jutsu of one's own element is a precondition for graduation would probably have ruined him if not for Shori. How was it? He heard Izuku ask. Of course he would be the first to ask. Kizuru noted how the kind boy's cousin paid increased attention to the answer that Shori would give. At the beginning, he'd been very much against the friendship the boy was building with Shori, especially since his cousin was very publicly and openly doing her best to ensure that Shori lost the top spot at the academy. He'd thought the boy had been some form of Trojan horse like Shori had told them about in that story. But 3 years together and he had to accept that the boy was mostly as genuine as he appeared to be. Even if Kizuru still thought he could see something sharp lurking behind the boy's eyes when he thought no one was looking. That was the hardest test I've faced in the academy, he said with a hearty laugh, forcing Kizuru to crack a smile. Looking around showed him that most of the class shared the sentiment. Shori was famous for never finding any of their exams or tests difficult in the slightest. Even when, 6 months ago, Uraraka-sensei had given them an impassable test to teach them about failure and the dangers of arrogance, Shori was the only one who didn't have any difficulty with the questions. He'd even somehow managed to get a perfect score on mathematics problems that were so far out of the syllabus that even Chunin would have had difficulty solving them. That's not a lot to go off of, Toshiro said, making him smile and shrug again before he walked in and took his seat in between Kizaru and Izuku while Toshiro himself was called in to take his test. Your test sounds very different from mine, he said, turning to his friend. You mean they didn't make you fight a Chunin as well? He asked with a laugh that rang hollow in the face of the class. Sudden silence. He'd fought a Chunin, a middle-tier ninja. Sure, Chunin weren't necessarily the strongest of opponents since their strength could vary wildly. He could have fought a Chunin from the cryptoanalysis squad or something, but the fact that he'd fought one, taken shorter than everyone else had on their test, and still come out unscathed was a feat beyond feats. If Kizaru wasn't personally aware of his terrible lying skills, he'd have accused Shori of trying to pull their legs. He could see some of their classmates coming to that conclusion on their own, and he almost tsked in disappointment. Shori never smiled when he lied. He did it with a straight face. Sure, it was the perfect way to deliver something that one wanted to be taken seriously, but considering he'd not even been able to avoid cracking a smile when he had to break the news to Inakuro that he'd broken his puppy's leg in their friendly spar, Kizaru had concluded that he'd smile no matter what. Only when he lied did he manage to avoid it. What do you think our teams will be? Izuku asked, making Kizaru slam back to attention. Team assignments. That was one thing that he'd been both thinking about and trying not to think about at the same time. After all, it could turn out very good or very bad for him. Uraraka-sensei hadn't given them much information on the matter. In fact, all he knew could be summed up in 3 points. 1. Their scores in the final exams and throughout the academy would be taken into account. He didn't know precisely how they would be considered, but it could range from putting the highest scoring students together or trying to balance it out by averaging a mix of the scores. He felt the latter would be less likely. Right from the beginning of their time in the academy, it had always been about putting the best of the best together. That was why he'd put so much effort into these exams. He'd studied his ass off, day after day and night after night. He'd punched posts until his fists bled and his aunt screamed at him for taking things too deeply. She never felt the pressure he did. The pressure to beat the best of the best that the strongest clans had to offer to make sure he ended up in the right team. 2. Their compatibility as people would matter. This was one of the places where he knew that he had the advantage over most of the others. He and Shori were friends. The best of friends, if he were being precise. The only one that could even vaguely be considered as close to Shori as he was Izuku, and being on the same team with the both of them would be perfect. He'd take the Uchiha as a third over most others. Especially that Nara who thought that she could intrude on their friendship simply because of their familial relations. 3. The balance of their abilities. Shori was good at everything. Everything that mattered, at least. But Kizaru was one of the few people in the class who could claim to be better than him at any particular ninja art. As the Kurama clan head, he was born for genjutsu. But he hadn't stopped there. He'd trained with his aunt until he'd gotten so skilled that he was even better than their Chunin sensei. His aunt called his genjutsu potential the highest she'd ever seen. Hopefully, that would mean that he'd be put on the same team with Shori to make up for any genjutsu deficiencies that might exist in the team. He was sure of it. He became even more sure when on the very next day, the class rankings were posted. As expected, everyone in Class A had passed the final exams, but the rankings were beyond what most people could have foreseen. He walked to the board with a light feeling in his chest as he stared at his position on the list. 1. Senju Shorirama. 2. Uchiha Uzume. 3. Uchiha Izuku. 4. Kurama Kizaru. No one would be insane enough to put Shori and Angry Uchiha on the same team, so he was sure of it. The three of them, he, Izuku, and Shori would be on the same team. Perfection. Few things could ever be so glorious. XXXXX Toshiro Takehata. The exams had been hard. The hardest thing he'd ever had to do. He'd trained his arsenal off for it, but even with that, he'd just barely been able to last long enough in the ring for the Chunin to count his taijutsu as a pass, and after doing and redoing the jutsu every day for weeks, he'd been able to execute all 5 jutsu required of him to graduate just without keeling over from chakra exhaustion. Shuriken jutsu was easy enough, but the addition of the hourglass to make sure that he hit all the targets in such a small time frame and moving targets to make it even harder had been one hell of a curveball. He'd legitimately wondered how Shori passed that section of the test. Unless it was with that bow of his, the senju boy had famously terrible aim. All his work had paid off in the end. He'd been ranked last in Class 3A, but that was the wrong way to look at it. He was ranked 12 out of 50 students that graduated the Konoha Academy this year. Sure, some of them were holdovers from last year who'd been forced to retake the exams, but that was how life worked sometimes. He, the son of a librarian, was going to have a Junin sensei and be placed in the same team as members of the best clans Konoha had to offer. He'd seen it, the looks that he got when he got home each day. It was even worse on Saturday, when everyone knew he'd be spending the entire day at the Senju clan complex. He was the only one he knew outside of the clan children at the academy that had gotten to talk to Hokage-sama in person. He was special. "How did you do?" Mom asked as he ran through the door, and he wasted no time to jump on top of her. He'd had a smile on his face from the moment he'd left the academy, and couldn't wait to share his joy with his mother. "I passed," he said, wincing as his mother winced from the loudness of his voice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but couldn't keep his joy down as she picked him up and twirled him in the air. "Don't be. It's good to be excited. My boy, you're going to be a ninja. My baby boy is going to be a ninja," she sang as she took him in the air. Years of training meant he didn't feel any of the dizziness that would have been par for the course, but he still had a good time, smiling as she smiled and laughing as she laughed. Toshiro loved to see how like this. It made it clear to him just how young his mother was. She'd given birth to him when she wasn't even 10 years older than he was now. She was younger than all his classmates' parents, but she looked older than most of them. Not when she smiled, though. When she smiled, her blonde hair came to life. Everything about her came to life at once. "I'll be the best ninja in the whole world," he told her, making her laugh and then "I'll find the bastard that put me in you and tear his intestines from his body he said next, but not out loud. Not to her. XXXXX. He sat at his regular seat. Far at the back. He liked it for 1,000,001 reasons. For one, it gave him a very good view of his role model in the class, Senju Shorirama. For another, it put him a fair distance away from the class. Most volatile elements Uchiha Uzume and Inuzuka Inakuro. The boy from the Inuzuka clan was much less likely to attack him than the angry Uchiha girl, but what he considered playtime could lead to serious injury if one wasn't careful. That dog of his was dangerous, as well, and Toshiro had learned from a young age to avoid animals. Dangerous creature, he thought to himself, unsure if he was referring to the creature himself or its owner. Sometimes, Toshiro felt there was no difference between them. Shori disagreed, but he had a habit of seeing nothing but the best in people. The Inuzuka boy was a beast, and so Toshiro would never keep his eyes away from him for long. It was only a few minutes until class started, and he watched Shori laugh as he spoke to the other Uchiha Izuku. Their conversations were always on a variety of topics, so unless he went closer or focused chakra into his eats to eavesdrop, then he was clueless as to what the conversation could be about. That was one skill Shori had. He could talk to anyone about anything. Toshiro had considered himself the most well-read person in his age group, but that was only until he discovered just how much time Shori dedicated to reading on a daily basis. He'd have thought that the heir to the premier ninja clan would have all his time set aside for training, but finding out that he scheduled every resting minute for reading had been a wake-up call for him. Even when Shori stopped training his body, he never stopped training his mind. Even now, he was still training. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, especially with how baggy his kimono tended to be, but Toshiro had better eyes than most. He was a stickler for detail. And when the wind moved through his clothing, one could spot, for a few seconds, the weights that he wore across every limb. Sitting down, standing, every movement was a form of training when one made use of ninja weights. Toshiro had considered doing it as well, but when he'd noticed the prices on his visit to the supply store, all his enthusiasm had dried out. Especially when the helpful lady at the store told him that it wouldn't be very useful for someone that was his age unless they had a medical ninja checking up on them on a nearly daily basis to heal the damage they were doing to themselves the right way and make sure they didn't accidentally get crippled. For the heir of the senju, that kind of expense would make sense. Not for him. Not when mom worked extra hours at the archive to make sure they had enough for rent and his ninja supplies. Quiet down, Uraraka-sensei said as he appeared in front of them. As I told you when I gave you these. He pointed at the headbands on their heads. Most of their heads, he amended to himself. Shori's headband was worn around his neck, and crazy Uchiha girl wore hers on her bicep in the same position as Nara-san. You are shinobi of the village hidden in the leaves now. That means you are to be the best of the best. You are now carriers of the will of fire and must be trusted to uphold both the will and the ideals of the village in all your dealings, he continued in a serious tone before suddenly pulling out a clipboard from nowhere. You already know that as members of Class A, you will be sent out in teams of 3 with specially chosen Junin-sensei. This is a special opportunity that you must be grateful for, he said, pinning them all with his stare. Uraraka-sensei was something else. He'd been like a father to most of them in their time in the academy, and Toshiro knew that he'd be far from the only one who'd miss their sensei after leaving. Here are the teams. Once I call your names, your Junin-sensei will walk in and take you with them, he said before taking an audible breath. Team 1 will be made up of Hyuga Uraum, Inazuka Inakuro, and Aburame Shiba, and you will be under the tutelage of Junin Shimura Danzo. At his words, a man appeared in the doorway. He'd entered the classroom without opening the door. Or he'd opened the door without them noticing somehow. No, Occam's razor as Shori called it. The simplest explanation. He'd always been there. Just under a genjutsu that prevented them from noticing. Even Hyuga-san was shocked, so that meant his genjutsu had been enough to fool even her advanced senses. Follow me, little branches, he said before disappearing in a shunshin. All 3 of his students looked between themselves, confused. Head to training ground 1-inch, Uraraka-sensei said, taking pity on them. Team 2 will have Yamanaka Inoken, Nara Shikahime, and Akamichi Choni, under Sarutobi Benzaiden. Their sensei walked in through the door with an easy swagger. He was the type of man who you'd see on the street and bestow with the epithet, cool. Sarutobi Benzaiden was a cool man, with his full beard and broad shoulders. We don't have all day. Let's get going, kids, he said, waiting for all his students to stand up before walking out at a sedate pace with them in tow. Team 3 Uchiha Izuku, Kurama Kizaru, and Sarutobi Omoikane under Uchiha Kagami. The class went dead silent at that. Even when the Junin entered the classroom, no one paid him any attention. Instead, all the genin in the room were looking between 2 people, Shori and Uchiha Uzume. What were the people in charge of the academy smoking? Putting Shori and crazy Uchiha together was a recipe for disaster. Even worse for him, he was on the same team with the both of them. He was a dead man. A very dead man. When his sensei asked them to follow, Kurama-san boldly resisted the order, preferring to stare at his friend in worry until Shori sent him off with an easy smile. Team 4, Uraraka-sensei said, addressing them since they were the only ones in the classroom at this point. Hitaki Tsukumo shall be your sensei, he said, and then a boy walked in. White hair and tall willowy frame marked him as a very handsome fellow. The only problem was that he didn't look to be much older than them. Not up to a decade older, for sure. He looked like a teenager, if Toshiro was being honest. Of course it was just his luck to be put with 2 people who wanted to kill each other, and a sensei that had the least experience of all the options. He sighed. Chapter 4. 4x Hitaki Tsukumo. This was realistically the best team he could have asked for. Sure, the one with the Uchiha and the Kurama heir was interesting, and the Akamichi, Nara, and Yamanaka combo were going to be lethal no matter what, but this was the kind of team that tales were told of. The senju heir, top of his class in the academy with the power to use B-rank jutsu, is a genin, the youngest child of the Uchiha clan head, who showed potential that far outstripped any of her older brothers in fire release or even the visual acuity of the Sharingan. And last and most definitely least, a civilian-born child with grades that outstripped the other 2 academically and the ability to recall and deduce information at a pace that put even the most prodigious Nara to shame. Like he'd already said, this was a team that stories were told of, but looking at them made him sure that this team wouldn't be getting any songs unless they went through some serious work. First of all, the Uchiha girl was glaring at both her teammates like they'd joined and severely offended her scrawed multiple instances and situations. That had to be the first thing to go. Second was the bow at the back of the senju heir. Tsukumo doubted that the heir of the second Hokage would walk around with a weapon he couldn't wield, but a bow was not a shinobi's weapon, and if he'd found some workaround, then perhaps a more discreet means to storage could be fine. The bow spelt him out as a Kong range specialist from miles away. Knowing his taijutsu scores, it was possible that the bow itself was a red herring, designed to make opponents underestimate his close-range potential and punish them when they failed. He left it as a maybe. The thing he'd definitely be removing was that smile. The Uchiha girl was angry, and he was perfectly pleased by it. He'd whip enough teamwork to turn them into real shinobi of the leaf into them. It was either that or they'd never leave the village on a mission, he swore to himself. The third teammate had a million things that needed fixing. The first was that fact that he was actively shying away from his teammate. While he knew that the girl would have no trouble tearing down the Takehata boy if she got the go-ahead, it was still shameful for him to cower away from aggression in such an open manner. No shinobi of Konoha would be showing that kind of behavior. Not even in the face of unbeatable odds. With all this in mind, he spoke his first sentence to them after summoning them to their chosen training ground. "My first impression of all of you is that you suck," he said to them in a deadpan tone. At his words, their reactions were telling. The Uchiha turned her aggression to him, trying to burn him with her gaze. The senju merely smiled even wider like he'd heard some sort of joke and relaxed his shoulders. Takehata shied even further into himself in the face of the false criticism. "But it's my job to make you suck less. Or it could be. Depends on if you can pass my test," he said, channeling the words of his first sensei as he leaned on the older man's expertise and wisdom not to mess up here. Test. No points for guessing which one of the three responded almost instantly with venom in their tone. "I took you for many things, but not simple, Uchiha Uzume," he said, ignoring the pitiful killing intent she shot at him. He chuckled to himself. "You see, passing the academy test proves that you are good enough to be genin of Konoha. But that doesn't tell me anything but the bare minimum. It definitely doesn't tell me that you deserve me spending even a second of time on you. That's what this test is going to do. If you turn out to be worth my time, then I'll train you. If not, it's to the reserves with you lot," he said to them, watching the words sink in. Uchiha raged, Takehata shrunk, and Senju smiled. Tsukumo got the feeling that he was going to eventually understand where the Chunin sensei had been coming from when he'd written in his assessment, Senju Shorirama is one least suited to the life of shinobi. Just purely on his mentality. His skills are better than mine already, but he takes everything as a joke of some sort. A joke only he sees. I do not feel he has the potential to be a ninja of Konoha. He will either break on his first mission, or turn out to be the kind of monster that Konoha cannot truly control. Recommendation. Fail, _. Of course, writing that about the second Hokage's grandnephew was not going to end well for him, but he applauded the man's dedication to his students. That had to be the only thing that would motivate some no-name to recommend failing the heir to Konoha's premier clan. Even Tsukumo, with all his pedigree, would never dare failing the children in front of him. Getting both the Senju and Uchiha on his case at the same time would be political suicide of the most comedic order. His enemies would most likely take breaks from delighting at his suffering to pity him. Either way, he had to get the measure of these children. And first things first would be robbing the Uchiha girl of that unfocused aggression and seeing if he could get the Senju boy to take something seriously. "When is the test, sensei?" "Now, of course. And as for what it is, the sun is at its highest point. Survive until sundown and you will be my genin," he said, giving them a completely impossible task. At his words, they all snapped into action faster than he'd expected. He tilted his head backwards to dodge a boot that had swung right for his head. He observed the Senju boy chuckling as he ran from the training ground and left both his teammates behind. XXXXXXX to Shiro Takehata. Of course she didn't waste a second trying to do something actually useful like coming up with a plan or even letting them know what she was going to do ahead of time. Yes, Toshiro, and he was sure Shori as well, had known that the girl would attack once she got the permission to. It was her entire personality, after all. But couldn't she have learned a new trick or two after graduation? He absently noticed Shori disappearing from the corner of his eyes as he whipped out two shrunken from his weapon purse and tossed them at his sensei at an angle. Mom said that these were supposed to test their teamwork, and as long as he showed some ability to work with the other two, then he'd pass. He was certain of it. Both his shuriken ended up proving more of a hindrance than a help to angry Uchiha-san as she heard them coming and disengaged. There had been very little risk of her getting hit by the stars, but part of him facepalmed at expecting her to trust in that with no guarantees. Engage in taijutsu, I'll help out from a distance, he signed at her in the sign language that Konoha had once favored for use within the Anbu. He knew she spoke it, as he'd seen her use it with her brothers before. Shori also knew it as well, but it was expected for the Hokage's heir to know every language within Konoha. Uzume knowing it had been a surprise for him when he'd first noticed. It had made him curious as to what her brothers did exactly. The fact that Mom hadn't said anything about them and had just gone silent when he asked meant only one thing: Anbu. She ignored his words and began to run through seals. It was a blur and ended with the tiger seal. He did well to jump backwards. He'd seen enough of the Uchiha girls' ninjutsu to know that this wouldn't end well for their would-be sensei. He was right. A massive ball of fire, large enough to completely block Toshiro's view of their opponent. Their sensei, a Junin, didn't seem too bothered by the jutsu as Toshiro didn't see him dive out of the way. In fact, as a shape appeared through the flames, it looked like their sensei had done the opposite. He dove right through Uchiha Uzume's flames, none the worse for wear, and slammed into her with a composed savagery. That was the only phrase Toshiro could think of. Their previous taijutsu exchange had been brief, but it had been mostly their sensei dodging out of the way as she relentlessly pursued. Now it was as far from that as possible. It was a beatdown. First of all, he'd near-folded her in half with a knee to her stomach. She'd reeled backwards but done nothing to avoid the follow-up punch to her temple. She tried to lift her hands to block the next jab, but it was an obvious feint for a kidney punch that their sensei delivered with punishing strength. She spat out blood and sensei used the opportunity to hit her with a palm to the face that broke her nose in one clean strike. Fuck, Toshiro thought to himself. This wouldn't end well. Shori had disappeared once Uchiha-san attacked. Of course he had. He'd probably seen this coming and decided that he'd be better served hiding from their sensei than taking him on in a straight fight. Toshiro prepared to jump away and attempt the same when he suddenly found himself pinned to the ground. He saw a vision there and then. If he moved, he'd die. Not in one fixed way, in a million different ones. Each more brutal than the last. He turned to find his sensei watching him with something resembling amusement in his eyes. His sensei was standing straight, not a wrinkle on his impeccably pressed Junin uniform. Not a single lock of spiky hair out of place from the organized mess that had caught Toshiro's attention back in the classroom. He looked to all the world that he'd just had a pleasant stroll in the park and not a life or death battle with who was arguably the most dangerous genin in all of Konoha. He'd put money on Shori in a fight, if he was a gambling man, but he'd still consider the Uchiha girl as much more dangerous. There was just a ferocity in her that he never saw anywhere. That was why the fact that she'd remained slumped in their sensei's pseudo-grip made for terrifying thinking. He'd beaten the fight out of her. This was the same girl who'd fought through a broken arm and used same arm to shove a punch into a shocked Shori's face, whining her the only spar she'd ever won against him. The fact that it was the last time Uraraka-sensei had allowed them to spar had also said a lot. In a blink he found a blur heading for him and didn't even notice when he moved his body to catch Uchiha Uzume as she was tossed in the air at him like a rag doll. Stay here. I'll go get that wayward teammate of yours and teach him a thing or two about abandoning one's comrades, was all he heard as his sensei disappeared in the wind. XXXXX Tsunade Senju. There was only one word she felt was appropriate for describing her little cousin: asshole. Sure, Uncle Tobarama would rather know him as a prodigy and Grandma Mito would rather know him as a sweetheart, but at the core of it, her little cousin was an asshole. It didn't matter how naturally talented he was when it came to the ninja arts. All that mattered was the fact that her little cousin couldn't take anything with an appropriate level of seriousness and was consistently pushed by the voices in his head to apply his deviant sense of humor to every situation. Case in point right now. I said I need to go inside to get my student, the man said, visibly frustrated. At least to her senses, though was visibly frustrated. She'd known Hitaki Tsukumo for years now and could just tell from the way he reached up to scratch his headband that he was near the breaking point. If it had been any other clan building, she would bet he'd have already bypassed the guards and made his way inside. Okay, that's enough. Let him pass, she said to the gate guard. A man by the name of Poki, she was reasonably certain. But Tsunade-sama, Shorirama-sama said, he began, but she interrupted with an easy plan. Good thing I can countermand his orders. Even beyond that, from now on, any of my cousin's orders relating to matters like this have to be approved by either myself, my grandmother or my granduncle. Is that understood? She asked rhetorically, already turning her back and signaling for the older Junin to follow her. Thank you for that, he said to her, rubbing his hair and not meeting her eyes. Hitaki Sakuma was a legend in his own right. She'd never gotten to see him fight, but Jiraiya had run a mission or two with the man and claimed that he'd probably be able to beat all three of them working together. Don't thank me. Or if you have to, please do it by kicking my cousin's ass for me. I can't do it myself because our grandmother would throw a fit. She deflected the gratitude. But tell me why my cousin has seen fit to hide himself in the compound and bar your entrance. Aren't you supposed to be testing him? She asked, probing into her cousin's actions. The boy was difficult to understand, even at his most cooperative. He was nowhere close to that today. I gave his team the mission to evade capture until sundown, and he interpreted the orders to mean, abandon your teammates and retreat to your clan's protection, he said with audible irritation in his voice. She resisted the urge to chuckle, but she couldn't prevent the smile that broke across her face. It was a crafty solution, to be sure. If not for her being around, he'd have gotten away with it. Hitaki Sakuma was too disciplined to break into the Senju clan compound even with the good reason he had. What would end up happening would be that he'd spend some time outside the gates, trying to convince the stubborn guards and then given up before he'd have ended snapping at them. It was a good plan, and she told Sakuma the same. I agree. I would have been far more amused if he'd bothered taking his teammates with him for his stunt. At least, it would have shown that he had some ability to work well with others beyond using them to alleviate his boredom. I told my uncle that putting him on a three-man team, particularly this one, wouldn't end well. He works best with those who know how to think the way he does. A combo with the Uchiha boy and the Kurama heir would have been something to behold, she put forward. Sadly, we will never see the fruits of that. But I do agree slightly with the Hokage's reasoning behind this team. If they manage to get over the worst aspects of their personalities, and if the two divergent elements manage to get over their animosity with each other, then there'd be very little this team won't be able to take care of once they reach their full potential. He was trying to build another version of your team, 3 individuals capable of battling cage-level opponents once put together. He told her with a significant look, and she nodded. I guess that means you understand what it means for you to be chosen as the sensei for such a team, she told him. He merely nodded and they continued to walk in silence. She allowed him walk with his thoughts. He'd been placed in charge of the futures of 2 of Konoha's biggest clans, the 2 biggest, in fact, and there was nothing he could do to refuse. He'd have eyes on him whatever he did from now on, and he'd have students with intrusive and powerful families. She'd try her best with her granduncle, but she knew that if Tobarama Senju ever disagreed with the manner in which his heir was being taught, then he wouldn't hesitate to make his opinion heard. We've arrived, she said as they stood in front of the clan library. Of course this is where he'd end up. Shorirama Senju. You gave 2 seconds to get out of the library or I promise you won't like what I do when I come in myself, she said it near the top of her voice, and in less than the time it had taken for Sakuma to look at her in shock at the volume, her cousin appeared at the doorway with a finger rubbing at his left ear. Pretty sure you ruptured an eardrum with that one, cuz, he said irreverently. Good. Maybe I'll even heal you from that when I'm working on the rest of your injuries after your sensei is done with you. At her words, he finally turned to see the man next to her who was leaking killing intent like a waterfall. He instantly paled and turned to run before he was suddenly sent flying by a kick to the midsection. She tracked his flight path and noticed he was heading towards the training ground in the compound. At least Sakuma wasn't so far gone that he'd beat the boy in the residential district. She watched as her cousin's body burst into smoke and 'twas replaced by a log that hit the ground at the entrance to the training field and shattered to smithereens. This was going to be fun. Facing each other now, both sensei and student waited for nary a second before bursting into movement. With a shunshin, Shorirama was just able to dodge out of the way of his sensei's first strike. Distance gave him the time and space to knock that useless bow of his with 2 arrows. It was like every time someone told him bows weren't ninja weapons, he got more and more determined to keep up with it. Neither arrow did anything to hinder Hitaki Tsukumo's pursuit of his annoying student until the ground rumbled for a second before turning into a massive pit of pure mud between them. Hitaki flexed his knee for a second before pushing off and scaling the entire thing in one go. It was a mistake as Shorirama had put down his bow and was running through seals. A massive wave of water from the pond attached to the training ground rushed at his sensei in mid-air. The man then did something she'd never seen done before. At least not with jutsu above D rank. He formed a half-ram seal and just allowed the water wave hit him with no effect. He landed on the ground and then burst at his student again. He knocked the foolish bow again, this time enhancing all 3 arrows with wind-natured chakra. Tsukumo treated the attack no differently than he had with the first one and dodged away from all 3 arrows with contemptuous ease. Even worse, this time he was able to catch him before he could escape with a shunshin. The first kick was blocked with the bow, but said bow was wrenched from her cousin's hand by the second. They exchanged furious taijutsu and she marveled at how much progress he'd made with the skill at such a young age. He fought like a hyuga, but with technical proficiency only. He was far above even the most skilled genin she'd ever seen Orochimaru all those years ago. He leaned out of the way of a punch that would have made his brain ring and retaliated with a palm thrust that was reeking of chakra to her senses. Tsukumo dodged and then leaned downwards to sweep his legs off the ground. Her cousin kept his footing by jumping in the air for a quick second while forming a single-hand seal. The wind bullet jutsu hit Tsukumo, did nothing, and then he took a kick straight to his stomach that had him coughing up blood. She resisted the urge to wince since she knew that kick at least had to have broken a rib or two. The moment the kick hit, her cousin collapsed to the ground holding his stomach and whimpering. When Tsukumo turned to her with a raised eyebrow, she merely shrugged. The hyuga were in charge of his taijutsu education. Of course the pretentious pricks had done nothing to fix up his pain resistance. "Stand up, brat," Tsukumo commanded, and in the span of a second, he had to lean out of the way of a blade that threatened to stab through his left eye. "Nice acting," he commented before blurring with speed. A single chop to her cousin's neck rendered him unconscious. "Do you mind healing him and the rest of the team, Senju-san?" Tsukumo asked, and while she'd have normally said no, a cough rang out across the clearing. "Yes, she'd love to," her grandmother said, walking deeper into the training ground and beginning to prod her unconscious grandson with her cane. Tsukumo didn't need an extra second to begin falling over himself to greet the old woman. "I would have expected his training to have gone further," she said idly, after completing the formalities. "He's been focusing on a lot more things than simply getting better at fighting these days," she said, feeling the inexplicable urge to defend the asshole. She could see in her grandmother's eyes who exactly she was comparing Shorirama to. She'd once been a recipient of looks just like that one. Everyone expecting the second coming of Hashirama. That expectation might have explained away her cousin's general demeanor if she wasn't well aware of the evil that had laid in his heart from birth. A born asshole, he was. XXXXX Tsukumo Hitaki. "So what did you do wrong?" he asked, talking to the freshly healed team of 3, and doing his best not to react to the guests at the training ground. If he'd known that the matriarch of the Senju clan would tag along once he asked for Tsunade Senju's help, then he would have gone without it. "I should have hidden at the Hyuga clan compound instead," his most troublesome student said with a sore tone until he heard a sound of wood striking skull. At least the presence of the Senju matriarch would maintain the good behavior of her charge. "No. You failed the moment you abandoned your teammates. Those who abandon their comrades are less than scum, not worthy to live in this ninja world. Do you understand me, Shorirama Senju?" he asked, flooding the clearing with his killing intent. The boy shakily nodded, performing a better job than his teammates but still unable to completely shake off the effects of his killing intent. "No. No you don't. Not yet, at least. But I promise that you won't be getting any missions until I beat that into your head," he said, making all 3 students wince. Only the Uchiha and Senju had felt the strength of his displeasure, but the civilian-born third had gotten a front-row seat to what would happen if they failed to perform up to standard. "I'll tell all 3 of you what you did wrong in turn. Uchiha Uzume, you ignored your teammates and went in on your own. You also ignored your teammates' plans when he communicated them to you. Takehata Toshiro, you were weak and you failed to work around your uncooperative teammate in an effective manner. Shorirama Senju, you abandoned your teammates. In spite of all your individual failings, I see potential in this team. I will be passing you, and in the next few months, I will beat some teamwork into you or break you and reforge you as a team. Whichever comes first. Now, you are dismissed. Meet here again by 0600 hours tomorrow. Chapter 5. 1000 Hands OC Senju SI. 4x Tsukumo Hitaki. When he had said that he would beat teamwork into them, he had not expected that they would make him have to actually do it. He'd thought that their first experience against a completely superior opponent would teach them that they had to work together, but he had clearly been mistaken. Now, they tried their best to work around each other, with the Uchiha girl unwilling to stomach even the thought of relying on any of her teammates and the senju being too consumed with his amusement at very unamusing situations to spend time thinking on working with his teammate. He would never have expected that the civilian would turn out to be his favorite student, but it had happened. He caught the kick aimed at his leg and then stretched the limb before moving to snap it in two. The boy dissolved in mud immediately after. The Senju family knew what he was trying to teach, but they were also perfectly willing to encourage their scion's foolhardy quest to overcome him on his lonesome. Hokage-sama probably saw it as a win. The boy they'd struggled to make focus on his Ina arts as a priority was now growing by leaps and bounds as he struggled to get strong enough to beat his Junin sensei. His body flickered backwards as a massive fire missile tore through the air where he'd once been. Working together, the two of them would have been able to make any regular Junin sweat. But with the way, they ignored each other and seemed dead set on getting the other caught up as collateral damage from their attacks, even a Chunin could dispatch them with careful planning. He flexed his chakra coils and broke from the genjutsu that the third member of the team tried to put him under. Takehata Toshiro could work well with Shorirama Senju, but he'd learned to look out for it, and now the boy was determined to harmonize his attacks with that of the Uchiha girl as well. He was the glue that gave the entire arrangement some semblance of teamwork. Senju followed him in his shunshin and appeared with a kick aimed for his head again. The same attack twice told him something was wrong, and he was proven accurate as the boss tore to shreds as 7 different air bullets shot through it, heading for him. He surrounded himself with chakra, leaning on his trained wind release affinity, and nullified the jutsu before it hit him. At least, the constant spars had been just as useful for training his skills as it had for training theirs. Jutsu nullification was quickly transforming from a cool idea in the cradle to a working technique that could turn aside even B-ranked offensive techniques with the right forewarning. "Alright, my turn," he said, as he prepared to jump at them. XXXXXX 2 months later, 3 months since the formation of Team 4. "You will cease this illogical sidelining," an elder from the side spoke up. This was his first time in a meeting like this, and now he found that he did not enjoy it at all. Especially considering how he had been summoned with no warning while in the middle of a training session. He'd just been forced to contend with a unique chain of earth and water release jutsu from his own senju genius. Taught by the man sitting at the center, undoubtedly. "I will not send the team on any missions until I am satisfied with their ability to work together," he said, feeling like a broken record as he was forced to reiterate his points over and over again. And yet, the Anbu have seen them execute tactical formations and arrangements as a unit, another elder spoke out. It was clear that the Hokage did not want to be seen unnecessarily interfering with the activities of the team that contained his heir, and was allowing the council of clan heads to bring up the concerns instead. Yes, they have. But almost always unknowingly. Both standouts of the team Shorirama Senju and Uzume Uchiha are uninterested in cooperating with one another, and so are being directed by their third member, Takehata Toshiro, to complete attack patterns that bear similarities to existing formations. It is an impressive feat of tactical and strategic acumen, but it still fails to show the same results as true teamwork. In their first clash with a skilled enough opponent, all 3 of them will be taken apart and killed with little fanfare, he said, trying to impress the severity of the situation on the council. The Uchiha clan head, Uzume's father, took a breath. That sound alone put the room on edge. He sat at the opposite end of the large table from the Hokage, and it was clear even from the feeling of his chakra that he was not a man to be underestimated. "My daughter is a shinobi of the Uchiha clan. It is unacceptable that she has been held back from missions for this long. I killed my first man at the age of 7. Hokage-sama did it even younger. Team 4 must be sent out. They will learn to work together, or they will die." Tsukumo did not flinch at the words said. Even though the fact that the girl's own father would display such a callous attitude did take him aback. He buried the instinctive flash back to his upbringing. No, Konoha would be different. It had to be. She is a shinobi of Konohagakure. You mean, the Hokage said, pinning the Uchiha clan head to his seat with a stare until the proud man conceded the point with a nod. Beyond that, I agree with your words. My brother created this village so that children would not be forced to die in senseless war, but these are not children. They are shinobi. Blade over heart. They will overcome their foolish and childish rivalries in the fires of conflict. Team 4 will leave for its first mission tomorrow. He wanted to object, to argue. They weren't ready. Not for the kind of missions he took, at least. But he was a loyal ninja, and his cage had spoken. Yes, Hokage-sama. Dismissed. XXXXXX Shorirama Senju. Gather the chakra, spin it to create rotation, add density to create power, and then contain it all in a stable shell. The Rasengan that formed in his palm was perfect. Of course, it was. He'd invented the jutsu while still in the academy. He never got the chance to even consider hiding the discovery or his training. Chakra training was dangerous, and the heir to the Senju clan wasn't even allowed to dream of training on his own without some sort of supervision. Even worse, his supervision ended up being a member of the Hyuga clan more often than not, and if you managed to hide anything from the Byakugan, then you'd need an award of some sort. He'd decided that it was better to just come clean with it and practice it in plain sight. That also meant that he had to engineer a lot of unnecessary trial and error into the jutsu creation project, but that had ended up being for the best. He probably understood the Rasengan better than everyone not named Minato Namikaze. Considering he hadn't even joined the academy yet, Shorirama was the uncontested master of all things Rasengan. It was worth it because the sphere in his hand began to shift in shape, blades shooting out from the edges as he manipulated the shape and form of the jutsu. He lifted it above his head as it took the form of a spinning shuriken the size of a windmill shuriken above his head. No wind release, yet. But he'd been able to prove his theory that the Rasengan could be made throwable as a pure shape transformation technique. Anything else would be subordinate. It also meant that he was one step closer to completing Project Quincy. He tossed the technique into the mini forest that he trained in, and it mowed through a few trees before it lost its consistency and disappeared. It would kill a man just as good as any technique, but it did lack a lot of the more explosive properties of a proper wind release, Rasenshuriken. So what are you going to call that one, young master? He heard the voice from behind him, and he forced a smile on his face before he turned to look at the Hyuga branch member that had been sent to follow him today. The same person that was sent with him on most days, he knew. If only he could ever manage to remember the man's name. He was certain he'd never been told, but also not completely certain. It wasn't impossible that he'd forgotten the man's name. It would also be highly embarrassing if he asked and found that he'd already been told. Rasenshuriken, Hyuga-san, he said, not for the first time being thankful for how much the Hyuga clan remained sticklers for traditions and old-fashioned etiquette. A fitting name, young master, the man replied, and it was all Shori could do not to gag at the blatant arskissing. Sure, he knew that that was probably the man's nature. That didn't stop him from feeling awkward whenever the man began going on and on about how skilled Shori was, or how much of a prodigy his superior Hyuga genes made him. The man seemed intent on ignoring Shori's conspicuously brown eyes and their very noticeable pupils. He'd been tested multiple times across his childhood, and everyone had finally been forced to accept that he would never get the Byakugan after he turned 8. Thank you, but we have to leave. I have a mission to get ready for, after all, he said, and began making his way back to the clan compound. Perhaps his teammates had failed to see it, but he was certain that there was something else behind their sensei's sudden switch in tactics. Everything he'd seen from Hitaki Tsukumo so far had told him that the man was not the type to give up merely because something was hard. He'd made the decision not to go on any missions with them until they mastered teamwork, and Shorirama was certain that he would live up to the threat. Shorirama had even banked on it. Constant sparring sessions against an opponent far above his level had taken his skills to new heights at speeds that felt frankly unfair. He'd have got a big head about how much progress he was making if he couldn't see that Toshiro was gaining just as much, and that Uchiha Uzume and her cheating eyes were learning even faster than he was. She'd already used a few of Shorirama's own jutsu against their sensei, and while he wasn't offended since he hadn't invented those jutsu himself, he was a bit peeved at her progress outstripping his. Only the fact that the original gap between them had been so large had kept him still ahead of her. Hopefully, the equalizers he was working on would be enough to widen the gap when necessary and ensure he was ready for what he knew would come in 10 years. Yes, young master. I have taken the liberty in ensuring that your equipment would be packed and prepared, he said. And my bow. It is assumed that young master would not intend in taking the instrument with him on a mission outside the village's walls. Shori smiled wryly. Please have it included. It is a key piece of equipment, after all. I'd hate to not have it and need it, he replied. He'd found it funny how virtually every adult shinobi tried to get him to give up on the bow. It was his bit of rebellion against the establishment. And bows were cool AF. XXXXXX Toshiro Takehata 9 years until the outbreak of the Second Great Shinobi War. Don't forget the plan, their sensei said, and then disappeared. He resisted the urge to gulp. How could he ever forget the plan? It was his plan, after all. They stood in the tree watching the bandit encampment through Fuinjutsu-enhanced binoculars. Having a senju on the team was such a hack. They got the best stuff. His mother even said that these binoculars weren't cleared for issue to Junin yet. And yet, Shorirama had just fished out 4 of them from the bag like it was nothing. It probably was. Toshiro had seen the kind of ballpark senju wealth existed in. I trust you, his friend said, and then clapped him on the shoulder. It was a classic example of bad intelligence. On their 7th mission in as many months, they'd been sent to root out and destroy a bandit camp. He noticed a theme. Unlike virtually every other team in their graduating class, they'd only been sent on one type of mission. The kind where direct combat was probable. Nay, it was expected. They were expected to seek out opponents and fight them. His best guess was that the administrative arm of the village thought his team wouldn't be good for much else. He couldn't disagree, he thought, looking at his teammates. Uzume had fished out a gunbai of all weapons a few months ago, and now she was giving the gigantic and unusual weapon a few anticipatory swings. She was deadly with the thing, he knew. Shori already had an easy smile on his face. The kind of smile that was a harbinger of mischief. That was what he was taking advantage of with this plan, Shori's natural skill at deception. Like he could sense his thoughts, Shori smiled at him and then dropped out of the tree they'd been standing in. As he landed, his appearance shifted with an application of chakra so precise that the telltale puff of smoke that marked the transformation jutsu was nowhere to be found. A medical ninja for a cousin meant Shori had the best chakra control of them all. Even better than sensei if the man was to be believed. Toshiro had since learned that Tsukumo Hatake rarely ever spoke the truth. And in the few instances he did, there was always an extra layer of subtext only available to those who bothered to look, underneath the underneath. Shori's gait shifted, becoming more panicked and hurried. He always found it fascinating just how many messages humans could pass with nothing but body language. It fascinated him, but people like Shori and Kizaru they obsessed over it. Years ago, he'd found it quirky how they played games where they took on different personas and kept poking at each other to get the other to break character. Now, he could see how useful that had become. Observant as he thought himself to be, he couldn't see a single sign that Shori was anything more than what he presented himself as. A scared child running into a group of bandits, unknowing of the fate that awaited him. Help, help, he shouted, voice sounding higher pitched than usual, and also much louder than the whisper he preferred these days. Wind release training had a habit of straining the vocal cords, he'd explained. Toshiro looked to his side and noted Uzume watching everything with her bright red eyes. 10 months as a genin had, between training with a Junin and missions where combat was guaranteed, developed her Sharingan to the perfect state. 3 tomo in each eye. His reading told him that most Uchiha didn't get to that level until they were well into adulthood. Uzume was just 11. They all were. Hey, it's a kid, one of the bandits said, looking down from the wall of the encampment they occupied to get a good look at Shori. Encampment was a hell of an understatement. Somehow, the bandits had managed to find and take possession of an old fortress from the Warring States period that had been abandoned by the clan after they'd moved to Konoha. He couldn't quite tell which clan it had been, but he would make sure to ask Shorirama after they'd taken the place. What do you want, kid? Another asked as Shori kept shouting for help. My fat father. He's in true trouble," were those tears. Shori's commitment to the act was commendable. The bandits on the wall wasted no time in dropping their guards. "What happened?" one asked. "RCA caravan. A wheel broken when Dad was trying to fix it, his leg. It be our bro." He collapsed into further tears. "Please help us," he finally screamed out through the tears. Toshiro knew that if he could look at the bandits' eyes, there'd be Ryo's signs floating in them. Free money. They were unlikely to say no. They were also very likely to do the stupid thing and abandon their posts at the gate without waking up the others. They'd be keen on keeping as much of the loot for themselves as possible. Their intel said that the leader of this particular group was a greedy man who did little if any sharing of the loot with the subordinates. His gamble paid off as the men whispered to themselves before one of them spoke, "We'll help you, kid. Stop crying. Just take us to the caravan." Toshiro's heart skipped a beat as it seemed like only half of them were going to follow Shori. But after a short argument, the half that had been supposed to wait behind joined in with the half that were going to follow Shori. All 13 of them trooped out of the gate, greedy smiles on their faces and weapons clutched in their hands. "Take us there, Gaki," one of them said in the kind of tone that made Toshiro itch to put a kunai through his head. Shori did his job and began to lead them away, making him release a breath he hadn't even known that he'd been holding. "Okay, it's our time to shine," he whispered at his teammate. She did nothing but grunt at him, but it was a meaningful improvement. At least, she no longer just blatantly ignored him and his plans. He hated how she acted like he was beneath her, but that was a matter for another day. They flew through the tree line at top speed, jumping into Thu Fortress at opposite ends. He had faith in her to carry out her path. The only genin more skilled than Uzume was Shori, and he was incomparable to anyone else. He weaved seals, spreading a genjutsu through his part of the building. Shori had taught him this one from the senju library. It did nothing but make the victims fall asleep. It was more useful than most others because it wasn't designed to affect only a single target like most other genjutsu. It was area of effect. That made it slightly weaker than if it had been used against only a single target, but they were civilian bandits with no ninja training. They had virtually no genjutsu resistance. He felt the genjutsu take hold, and he began to make his way from room to room, careful to step on only the balls of his foot. The first room was empty. The first 4 he checked were empty. It was only in the 5th room that he found a single bandit sleeping. His snores bounced against the walls of the room. Toshiro made sure to creep silently and applied some chakra to his feet to ensure that the room remained silent. He leaned over the man on the futon and closed his eyes to steel himself. Blade over heart. His lunatic flashed for a second as he sliced through the carotid artery as he'd been taught. He stood up after being sure the man was dead and moved on to the next room. It was a butcher's job, what he did. But he was a shinobi. These men threatened the people of Konoha. His mother. He had to fulfill his duty. Part of him wondered if Shori and Uzume ever had second thoughts about things like this. He forced himself to stifle the chuckle. The idea was ludicrous. They'd been raised to be shinobi from the day their lives began. Things like this would be easy for them. He walked further into the fortress. 6. He'd eliminated 6 people so far. That meant that there were closer to 9 people on Uzume's half of the fortress. He opened the last room and almost stepped backwards at seeing 2 men in this room. Unlike the others, they were naked. He blocked the thoughts that rose in his mind. He knew what sex was. It wasn't surprising that 2 men in a stressful situation would lean on each other. He walked inside the room and made his decision to do his job. Both men were so entwined that it was difficult to get at one's neck. It was fine. He eliminated the first with a slice along the carotid-like routine. With the second, he rolled his body over, and somehow he managed to break out of the genjutsu. On seeing the shinobi over him, the man let loose an impressive scream. Toshiro stabbed his kunai through the man's open mouth and into his brain, silencing him. He just hoped that the noise hadn't ruined Uzume's part in the mission. He opened the door and was met with the Uchiha girl wiping off blood from her gunbai. It wasn't the blunt instrument he'd expected on the first time he'd seen it. The edges were deceptively sharp. "That was sloppy," she commented with a scoff. "I didn't ask for your opinion," he replied tersely. "Are you done with your end of the fortress?" he asked her. Yes, I am. Now we head to the leader of this mostly crew, she said, and he nodded. He was almost surprised that she'd made the effort to wait for him before moving ahead. It was the plan, but he was proud that she'd stuck to it. They moved up the stairs as one unit, walking in step. Both their steps were silent, and when they finally arrived at the door, it was to find it open. Uzume pushed it inwards, and it moved with no resistance. They found their target sitting on a wooden chair, waiting for them. It was shaped like a throne, all things considered. Given this was the great hall of the fortress, it wasn't much a surprise. So it was Konoha. My bet would have been on Iwa, he said, looking at them with a smile on his face. The darkness parted to reveal a tall man. Taller than Sensei. With long black hair in a ponytail and coal-black eyes. I've let you kill those useless fools with no resistance. I gain nothing in killing children. Turn around and count yourselves lucky, he said, not even standing to address them. It took a second for Uzume to cross the distance between them. Her gunbai cut through the throne as their target bent downwards to dodge out of the way of the attack. His hands slammed against the ground, and Toshiro was sure that it was only months of sparring with Shori that gave her the instinct to retreat. Where she'd previously stood was a single spike of gleaming stone. She weaved through seals of her own, but her fireball was denied by a massive wall of stone with a snarling tiger imprinted on it. Toshiro weaved seals and reached for their opponent's chakra network with his genjutsu. It took hold for only a second before snapping. The wall in front of them shifted, having spikes form along its surface. To deter them from climbing, maybe. His deduction was disproven. Dodge, he screamed as the wall came apart, and the spikes were sent hurtling at them. He dove to the side while he heard Uzume do the same on the other side. I won't give you another chance to retreat. Uzume scoffed across from him, and he almost chuckled at her reaction. Retreat. They were shinobi of Konohagakure. They did not retreat. Besides, they had the upper hand here. He just didn't know it yet. Uzume weaved 5 seals and he jumped pet backwards. He knew what was coming. Kaiten, Hosenka no Jutsu, she said, executing her own unique flavor of the phoenix flower jutsu. She spewed out several missiles of flame that fanned out in a wide angle, spreading across the hall before converging in on a single target. Their opponent. His hands remained on the ground and instead of a single wall, a giant dome of earth formed, surrounding him from all angles. The flame's attacks hit the dome and exploded. The smoke parted to reveal that the stone was unharmed. A few scuff marks were all that could be shown from the attack. Before the smoke had completely parted, a single blur dropped from the ceiling. Shori landed on the dome. He wanted to shout out a warning that the guy could manipulate the dome from the inside, but that was moot point as Shori placed his hands on the dome and Visible exerted his massive reserves to do something. He dropped from the dome with a chuckle. I didn't think that would work so easily, he said, looking at both of them, with a smile on his face. What did you do? Uzume asked, asking the question on both their minds. The dome fell apart behind him, revealing their opponent with several holes through his body. The body fell to the ground, limp, without the dome holding it up. The same thing he did with the earth wall he hit you guys with. I figured that if I overpowered the chakra he had in the jutsu, then I could manipulate his jutsu like it was mine instead. Bastard never even saw it coming, he said with an easy smile on his face. You stole my kill, was Uzume's reply as she released a grunt. Suddenly, the ground beneath Shori fell in as he was buried up to his neck. Their opponent appeared right above him with a hammer in his hand. Toshiro felt himself frozen in place. Uzume was in motion. Everyone looked like they were moving through jello. Each step Uzume took was slow. Too slow. The hammer arced down, aimed right for Shori's head. And then everything snapped back into reality. Their opponent's body was pinned to the wall. Sensei stood in front of him with both hands on the hilt of his chakra saber. The same saber that was doing the job of pinning their opponent to the wall. What did I say about dropping your guard? He was shouting at Shori. He'd never heard Sensei shout before. Never even seen any of the irritation that they'd caused him on his face. Now, he looked apoplectic. His normally flaccid easygoing expression was nowhere to be found. He looked an Asura from Naraka itself. And Shori was the subject of all that attention. I'm sorry, Sensei. I really thought I'd got him. That's one hell of a clone jutsu, he said, trying to change the subject with the smoothness that came so naturally to him, but their sensei was having none of it today. XXXXXX. So we've been genin for a year now, Izuku was the one who spoke. The rest of the gathering were spread out across the senju lawn like usual. These gatherings had become monthly things instead of weekly engagements, but Toshiro was impressed with the effort Shori made to keep up with his friends. After graduation, the circle had widened to include everyone in their graduating class. Some people came more often than others, but even Uzume could be found calmly drinking a cup of tomato juice in a quiet corner of her own. Yes, we have, Shori said. Did your sensei tell you about the thing? Kizaru was the one who asked now, in a whisper that had no chance of going unnoticed by the entire gathering. I'm willing to bet all our sensei did, Shori replied, not bothering with the whisper. I assume the thing you speak of is the exhibition to take place in the village next month, Yuraum said with her customary formal tone and low-pitched voice. He'd have mistaken her for a boy, with how deep her voice could get every so often. Of course, those thoughts were never expressed. Stupid thoughts were best left in the head before they infected the air. Yes, it is, Kizaru said, not even turning to her. He kept his attention on Shori, who was moving around Choni as the larger boy worked on the grill. Shori hadn't given up on figuring out how the Akamichi pulled off their food-related sorcery, and Choni was amused enough to let him observe the whole process every single time. 9 months of effort had yielded nothing so far, as Shori's food was always found wanting. What do you think about it, Shori? Omoikane asked, putting words to the question his teammate was obviously itching to ask. I think it's going to be fun. Just imagine how much we'll learn from fighting against shinobi from Kumo and Kusa, and even Taki. There's going to be a lot of foreign shinobi here for us to learn from, he said. No one said anything about fighting, Shikahime pointed out with narrowed eyes, but Shori just waved her point away. We're shinobi. The only thing we can do that will entertain the civilians is fight. Considering the size of the stadium being built for this, I'm willing to bet that Uncle is expecting a massive audience. Wouldn't do to bore them all, would it? He said with his trademark smile and winked at her. Is it even safe to have so many foreigners in the village all at once? Enoken asked, flipping his long ponytail to get some hair out of his bright blue eyes. It has to be. Hokage-sama has been working on this for a while. Besides, the war ended over a decade ago. The shinobi nations are at peace. This kind of thing is just supposed to be more cooperation to help strengthen that peace. This exhibition is going to be a substitute for war, that's what my uncle said. If we children fight it out, then the adults won't have to, was Omoikane's response. He spoke with the tone of someone repeating something he'd been told, but Toshiro found no reason to disagree with him. None of the other villages would be bold enough to attack them here. They'd be surrounded and cut down. The sizzling of the meat on the grill was the only sound to be heard for a while until Shori sighed in disappointment and went to pick up his bow. China's chuckles followed his path. What's a Naruto fanfic without Chunin exams? Nothing. In this missions will work differently. I'm going to assume, with no evidence, that D ranks were invented by Hiruzen and that at this stage, the only missions Genin with Junin sensei took were the ones that the Junin would ordinarily have been sent on. Yes, it's not the most efficient system and has numerous obvious flaws, but it's my story and I can do as I wish. Thank you for reading. The next 3 chapters are up on the place of Potron's same username is up here, so feel free to check it out if you want to support my journey, but don't stress if you can't. Everything will come up here in its own time. Thank you for tuning today's video fanfiction story. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments for the next exciting installment.